product that is well known as Dave's favorite bearing.
This is Dave's favorite bearing. This is main bearing on the drive side where the clutch goes. He loves to measure cases and tell you that this is all jacked up.
This refers to the drive side roller bearing that was used on the BSA and Triumph twins really from 1966 all the way up until the end of production in the early 80s. So it's a confusing bearing because one part number was applied to 3 different bearings and some of the specifications changed. So we know that most of the early versions, the 650 models, left the factory with what would be called a CN condition, which was a normal clearance. And the diametral clearance is between the inner race and the outer race. And the 650 models and the earlier 750 models all used a CN clearance from the factory. At some point in time, probably during the 76 production run of the 1977 model year bikes, Brian Jones, who was the product designer for Meriden or Triumph, changed that specification to a C2, and it was really in an effort to try to minimize vibration and rumbling as...
Mail guy.
Mail guy.
You came right in the middle of our video shoot.
And these can be a pain in the butt, so just bear with me. Mailman.
Will be the outer race that will have the rings, but oftentimes a bearing that won't have a mark on it is considered a CN. So if you take the the outer race, remove that from the crankcase, you'll will see that, and so the 2 rings denote that it's a CN clearance, which is a little confusing in itself because the C2 clearance was 1 ring, and that was the tighter fitting bearing or less diametral clearance between the inner race and the outer race. It was considered necessary by Brian Jones, who was a product designer at Meriden, that in order to cope with the added stress of the 750 displacement, that they were trying to keep the engines quieter and reduce the rumbling, and so they tightened up the manufacturing tolerances on the bearing, also the machining on the crankcase itself, or the port where the bearing resides. So that spec change for the 1977 model year, historically, I've never seen any information about it, what engine number that occurred or when, but that when we're suggesting roller bearings for the drive side crank on T140s, we always want to ask the customer when was the bike made, what model year is it. That helps us to specify what bearing we can recommend for that. Consequently, C2 bearings aren't nearly as prevalent as the CN bearing, which was used in the first generation of the T140s and all the 650 Triumphs and BSAs from 1966 on through 77 model year. So there are times where a machinist may call for a C3 clearance, which is an increased clearance between the inner and outer races. If there is like some distortion, for example, in the crankcase, the port where the bearing resides, of course, if there's run out on the crank, if the machinist measures the crank in a lathe, they can see if there's a 0.5 or 1,000th of run out. The crank's not rubbish because of that. You just oftentimes it would be recommended that the C3 bearing would be used in that case, or in a competition engine where noise and factors like that aren't really a consideration. So we don't sell as many C3s. CN is generally the most common bearing on the drive side in that roller bearing specification that we'll be selling. And it's also a recommended practice that whatever bearing is removed from that engine, whether it's a C3 or more likely a CN, in general, that's the bearing you're going to be replacing it with. So when the opportunity comes up to replace the bearings during an engine rebuild, it's important to know what bearing, which of the 3 versions of that 70, 28, 79 Is that right? Did I get that right? I think that's the right number.
Yes,
Okay.
that's it.
Which version of the 702879 or Dave's favorite bearing we're going to use there? BSA used the part number 680625 for their engines from 66 through 1972. And that was a bearing that was always a CN. So prior to 66, they used a ball journal bearing just like the one on the timing side. And Triumph did also. That was one of the upgrades for 66, that these engines were now making enough power that for the crank to cope with that, most of the stress is on the drive side, where the engine sprocket is connected to the primary drive or the clutch, and then onto the secondary drive, which is the countershaft sprocket from the transmission to the rear sprocket. So there's more stress on that side of the engine, and that's one of the reasons that the roller bearing itself with the separate outer race is a better choice and generally regarded as a better performance bearing for those engines. Obviously, if you suspect the bearing is bad, spend the money and replace it. When the question comes up, which bearing should I use? Which clearance should I use? That's a good time to ask your machinist or your professional engine builder which one. At the Bonneville shop, we stock all three conditions. We have the C2, which is the tighter clearance, the CN, the normal diametral clearance, and the C3, which is the looser.
And so you kind of mentioned if it fits, but what are the telltale signs that you should replace it if you're looking at it with that?
Well, there may be a case where the bearing just slides on the shaft and there's no resistance at all. Maybe the most common one is when the retainer, the cage, if you will, for the rollers, when that's damaged, it's somewhat difficult to get the bearing off of the crank without damaging it unless you're really careful. The temptation is to prise it off with 2 screwdrivers. Bearing sitting on the shaft, you just get in there and heat it up a little bit and try and wedge it off. That can work if you're careful and experienced at it, but oftentimes the material that's used for the cage is a light metal. It could be brass, it could be steel. It's damaged very easily. Once that's damaged, there's really no correcting it. At that point in time, you should replace it. If you're rebuilding an engine that you know has 30,000 miles, for example, on the bottom end, replace it.
Okay, that's good.
So there is some opinions about when you should and when you can get away with it. And really the same goes for the ball bearing that's on the timing side, which that's a whole nother that could be a whole nother discussion.
Yeah.
There are some guys that are using that roller bearing from the drive side on the ball bearing side, like on T140s, for example. It may require some shimming, some thin metal shims. Some guys will use it between the bearing itself and the crank. Some guys put it behind the cup, or the outer race that's actually pressed in or interference fitted into the crankcase. I've never personally done that conversion myself.
Is that crazy?
It is kind of crazy.
It's not recommended, probably. But
Well, I mean, there's so many opinions about engine building. I'm not an engineer, I'm not a machinist, but I have some experience building these engines. I've found personally that replacing parts that were recommended and supplied from the factory are what that's usually what I go with. These engineers, even back in those days, these engineers that had a wall full of engineering degrees and all these accomplishments. This Brian Jones that I mentioned, he was the one that decided we need to change to a tighter clearance bearing to quiet these engines down. And he's obviously a well-respected engineer and was at Meriden for a long time.